Hello again, and welcome to this latest in a series of online video lessons intended to provide you important principles and handy tips to enhance your understanding and practice of argumentation. This is the second in a two-part series on policy case issue analysis. In the first part of this series, we talked about how we can understand a policy controversy broadly by reviewing the concepts of a prima facie case, a policy claim, and stock issues. To sum up very briefly, in order for the advocate of changing a course of action to be able to justify overcoming presumption and meeting the burden of proof for implementing a new policy, they need to establish an extended argument, a case that on its face provides good and sufficient reasons for changing the status quo in four key stock issue areas: ill, blame, cure, and benefits versus costs. So in the first part of this series, we talked about the broader concepts and then looked, generally speaking, at the four stock issue areas. We then looked at the specific argument strategies for the stock issues of ill and blame in more detail. So in the second part, we're going to look at the specific argument strategies that a policy advocate can use for the stock issues of cure and benefits versus costs. We'll then conclude by taking a brief look at something called an issues brief, a document that debaters both for and against a policy proposition will want to construct. Essentially, it's going to be a detailed outline that lays out all of the important arguments on each of the four stock issues, both for policy advocates and for defenders of the status quo. But first, let's very briefly recap where we are so far in a sample policy debate that we started developing for the purposes of explanation in our previous video. One public policy controversy of interest to most of us is the current student debt crisis. So we forwarded the following example of a policy proposition to illustrate the importance of the stock issues. The United States should provide free undergraduate education at public colleges and universities. And so in order to start justifying this change in the status quo through this new policy action, we first needed to discuss the stock issue of ill. Ill, as you recall, refers to the presence of a significant problem in our present system that requires a response. And we talked about how one can argue the case for ill in terms of two related arguments, quantitative and qualitative significance. Once we establish quantitative significance, for instance, by talking about millions of students under crushing amounts of debt, tens of thousands of dollars in debt, an amount that's skyrocketed over the past 20 to 30 years, we talked about how you can illustrate the significance of that huge magnitude of a problem in terms of assaults on our basic values. We described, for instance, the impacts of student debt on graduates that are faced with unemployment. We talked about how the impacts of the problem can affect not just the graduates, but also their families. We talked about how students might be constraining their educational choices and losing opportunities to contribute to society because they're more concerned with paying off their debt than actually doing a job that might mean something to them. And finally, we talked about the basic social justice issue that we face when students who want to pursue a college education simply can't because they're unable to afford it. And that means they're systematically denied opportunities that are absolutely crucial in a 21st century economy. Once we've established the ill, we then need to move on to the next stock issue of blame. Blame gets at the cause of a problem, because in order to fix a problem, you need to know what the underlying causes are. And so we talked about how a policy advocate wants to talk about structural causes of a problem, for instance, elements of a system like college finance and the student loan industry that perpetuate a particular problem, as well as the second area of blame, which is attitudinal cause, those beliefs and values by important stakeholders or those in a position of power and influence that keep the problem from being solved. In the case of this controversy, the potential relationship between the Sallie Mae student loan company, the U.S. federal government, and large banks who profit from the student loan industry that have a vested interest in keeping the system the way that it is, rather than solve the problem for the benefit of those who need to get a college education. Okay, so once we've established that there's a need to change the status quo through establishing ill and blame, we can move on to our third stock issue, and that's cure. What is the course of action that's going to solve this problem? There's a couple of things you need to do when arguing cure. The first is to present your plan of action. What is your course of action, including the relevant implementation details? This involves, first and foremost, what might be referred to as the mandate. In other words, what is, in a nutshell, the course of action? What is it that your plan is actually going to do? There may be other details as well that you need to establish. For instance, who or what organization is the agent of action? Who's going to be responsible for implementing this policy? And depending on the nature of the policy, you may also want to get into issues of funding and enforcement as well. How is this policy going to be paid for, and who or what is going to be responsible for making sure that the policy is implemented and enforced in the right way so that it actually works in the way that it's supposed to work. In the current proposition that we're working with for the purposes of this discussion, let's take a look at what might be a public policy course of action on the student loan crisis. So, the mandate for our proposition: federal funding for up to 4 years of tuition at a public college or university. Now, besides the mandate, we would probably want to let our audience or those making the decision know how we're going to accomplish this. So, the agent of action for the purpose of this policy would be the U.S. Department of Education, and we would probably want to talk about how this is going to be funded. How do you pay for federal funding for up to 4 years of tuition? So, let's say we could engage in targeted defense spending budget cuts, as well as tax increases on large-scale Wall Street speculation activities. The combination of expenditure cuts in one area of the budget with revenue increases in another area of the budget could be demonstrated to provide the funding that we need to provide 4 years of tuition for any college student in the United States who qualifies for admission to a school that qualifies. So, this would be our plan of action, but it's not just enough to have the plan of action. The second area of cure that you must get at is what gets referred to awkwardly in debate theory as solvency. In other words, the policy action solves the problem, at least to a significant degree. Now, in order to be able to establish that your plan of action is going to solve the problem, we need to go back to our earlier stock issues. You have to establish that your plan is going to address the blame. If you've already established that there are significant structural and or attitudinal barriers that prevent us from solving the problem, you have to be able to show then that your plan of action is going to circumvent or eliminate or otherwise transcend those barriers. And so if you address the blame, then you can move on to establish how your plan of action is going to alleviate the ill. How are you going to eliminate the problem or at least significantly decrease its severity? So, for the purposes of our proposition here, how would our plan solve the problem? Well, the plan eliminates the need for student loans and restrictive requirements for financial aid because it would make up to 4 years of college free at a public institution. So the result would be access to higher education for anybody who qualifies for admission. And what we could do to look at how this would actually solve the problem might be to make an argument based on the European model used in nations such as Germany, for instance, that demonstrates how such a plan can actually work on a national scale. So what we've done in the stock issue of cure is first presented a plan of action, and then secondly, shown how our plan of action can solve the problem. But that's still not enough. The final stock issue is to make sure that this plan of action is worth it. That's where we get to benefits versus costs. When an advocate for policy change argues for benefits, you need to establish that solving the problem itself results in beneficial outcomes. If we solve a problem and solving that problem doesn't make any difference, then why would we bother solving the problem? So you need to establish that solving the problem actually leads to good stuff. And in addition, you could also argue that beyond solving the problem, there are also added advantages, other good things that come about as a byproduct or some secondary or side advantages to implementing the policy. So for instance, what we could establish as a result of this policy is that gradual elimination of student loan debt and its consequences. If we eliminate the need for student loan debt by making college free, then eventually over time, we're not going to have to worry about entire generations of college graduates that are saddled in tens of thousands of dollars of debt and the things that we talked about with regard to the stock issue of ill. If students are temporarily unemployed for the short term and the long term, that's that much less problem they're going to have to deal with. We won't necessarily have to worry about the burdens on families. We have a greater opportunity for students to benefit in other ways as well. Greater college access is going to mean improved access to quality jobs. So not just students who would have gone to college anyway and taken out loans to pay for it, but those other students that we talked about earlier. Students that might have had a disincentive to go to college because they just couldn't afford it. Now, everyone can afford it if they qualify to get into college, and that means that far more Americans would have improved access to employment. And of course, to make matters even better, we might argue that this kind of policy would eliminate the disincentives in the current system to pursue degrees in lower paying, high impact professions. So what this could mean is, because we don't have to worry about college students thinking about their student loan debt first, they can focus more on their areas of personal vocation. We might get more teachers, we might get more social workers, we might get more members of the clergy, we might get more artists, and we could argue that these are good things that our society needs. Okay, so that's the stock issue of benefits. We have to then counterbalance that against the stock issue of costs, because we know that defenders of the status quo, opponents of our policy, are going to want to point out that there's going to be significant risks of disadvantages that are going to make this policy not worth it. So the policy advocate is going to have to establish that the alleged disadvantages either don't really exist in the first place, or they're not sufficiently significant. Maybe the problem exists, but it's really not a big enough deal to worry about, and or the benefits justify the risk of the disadvantages. Maybe some problems might crop up as a result, but the advantages that we get from solving the problem, as well as the added benefits that come from this policy, are just going to be more important. So, for the proposition we're currently working with, how might we address costs arguments? Well, we could say that the plan is paid for by current revenue sources, so opponents to this plan that would argue that it's just too expensive, it's going to contribute to the federal deficit and the national debt, well, that's just not true. The plan is paid for. Well, our opponents might argue, yeah, you said you paid for it, but you paid for it by cutting the defense budget and increasing taxes on people who do Wall Street investment speculation. And both of those can be problematic for a number of reasons. Well, the policy advocate might want to argue in advance that the advantages of improved education and employment for American citizens outweigh the less important losses to the defense industry and to Wall Street corporations. If the policy advocate were to be able to argue, for instance, that the cuts that one would make in the defense industry would primarily be cuts in very expensive weapon systems that, quite frankly, we just don't need in order to adequately defend ourselves, and that the tax increases on Wall Street speculation are not going to involve any kind of significant financial hardship to anybody in the United States, including those Wall Street speculators, that it's just more important to try to improve education and employment for American citizens. The upside far outweighs the downside. So if we have a sense of the arguments that the policy advocates need to make for ill, blame, cure, and benefits versus costs, we need to put all of that stuff down so that we can start building our case. And that's where the issue brief is going to come into play. According to Inch and Tudor, the issue brief is a synthesis of opposing views on the stock issues of a proposition. It's important to note here that an issue brief is going to be prepared on both sides of the proposition, regardless of whether or not the advocate is supporting a proposition or opposing a proposition. Because whichever side you take, it's going to be absolutely important to make sure that you understand what the arguments are going to be on those stock issues on both sides. This brief is going to involve many issues and options and generally needs to include evidence and reasoning supporting the outlined claims. In other words, it's going to be a relatively developed outline that's going to lay out pretty piece by piece, step by step, here's what the major arguments on all of the stock issues are going to be. So, Inch and Tudor's text on page 247 lays out a basic template of what they refer to as a needs analysis case. This is perhaps the most basic version of how you would put together a case along the stock issues of a policy proposition. So you can see on the left-hand side, this is what the brief would look like for the case in favor of policy change. So Roman numeral 1, there's a need for a new system that involves significant ills and the present system is to blame. So the stock issues of ill and blame taken together establish we need to act with a policy response. Roman numeral 2, there's a plan that can solve the problem. And so we're going to lay out the plan, what agent's going to act, what is that agent going to do, what's the mandate, and then we argue solvency, that the plan is actually going to solve the ill. And then the third major section, in addition to solving the ill, the following benefits and advantages are going to accrue. What might not be a bad idea as well is for this, what we would call the affirmative side in a debate, the advocate for policy change, might want to also have some preemptory arguments against the possible costs arguments that are going to come from the opposition. What we see on the right-hand side is very parallel, right? But this is going to be the case that's made by what's referred to in debate as the negative, as the opponent of the change. So Roman numeral 1, there's no need for a new system, and so it addresses the ills being insignificant or not existing, and secondly, that the present system is capable of handling these ills. So there isn't the structural and attitudinal opposition that would make change impossible. The second section deals with the plan, and so it focuses specifically on problems with the plan implementation regarding the agents or the mandate, and then of course the issue of solvency. Even if the plan does work, it's not going to solve the problem. Third section, the plan won't receive any benefits, and so it directly addresses the alleged advantages that the affirmative side would forward. And in addition, a final section that the negative would argue is that this plan of action is going to accrue many costs or disadvantages. It's important to note that when we're dealing with the stock issue of costs in benefits versus costs, we're not just talking about costs in a financial sense, in a money sense, but costs involves any kind of downside, a risk of problems, in other words, disadvantages. All right, so you can see from this brief that what you have once you've completed it is a pretty thorough map of what both sides are going to have to argue on each of the stock issues. So you need to start your initial issue analysis with figuring out the basic skeleton of what your side is going to need to argue and what the opposition is likely to argue. Of course, this is going to involve a process of preliminary research in order to figure out what those stock issue positions are. And then as you lay out the skeleton of the brief, you're going to engage in additional research in order to find information and a sense of what those arguments are out there in the public sphere that develop these stock issue positions, and then the brief will develop and develop until you have a pretty complete outline of the arguments that both sides are going to make. All right, so in order to sum up what we've done in this lesson, we've looked at the need for a prima facie case for a policy proposition to address these stock issues: ill, blame, cure, and benefits versus costs. So if an advocate for change is going to fulfill their burden of proof and overcome presumption, they need to provide on the face of the case, that rhymes, they need to provide right up front that they have good and sufficient reasons for change in all four of these areas. Because if the affirmative side, if the advocate for change doesn't prevail in the debate on each of these four stock issues, then they have not fulfilled the audience expectations to overcome presumption, and the policy change isn't justified. And so once you engage in this analysis, you're able to construct an issue brief that plots out the major arguments you're going to make on both sides of the case regarding each of these stock issues. So if you have any questions at all about these concepts or how you would apply them in a debate over a policy proposition, please don't hesitate to let me know. Otherwise, I'll see you next time.